In my last Digital Circus video, there was one comment that stood out to me about a particular topic regarding Caine, and I felt like making a new bed for myself to expand more upon the idea on Caine's fate and exploring on whether or not it was well-deserved or tragic in that light. What's up guys, it's Willie, and today, I'm back discussing about the amazing Digital Circus, and now this time it's not your typical theories or speculative sort of videos that I would normally do during the awaiting of the upcoming episode, cause this time, I want to dive into a very particular topic that seemingly has been met up with debate, and that is regarding the interpretation of Caine's fate, whether it was warranted or tragic. And a way that I'm going to work this out is diving through Caine's history, through all the collective material from the show, and it paves way for me to discuss in brief the main points that would fit well for both angles. And for this resolution, I would, in my opinion, discuss which angle from this debate is justifiable. And it is really the intrigue when it comes to elaborating and dwelling on the main stems from each point. Now, before continuing on, if you're someone who's new here or haven't yet had the chance to do it, tap the like in this video and subscribe to my channel so you wouldn't be remiss of any sort of Digital Circus content that I'll be creating in the future. So letting that one off my chest, let's get straight into it with this video. So just evaluating everything that we knew of Caine from the start, we learned that Caine was an advanced AI project that was successfully made and programmed by a computer company that we all know of as the CNA. And with this, what I would say, elite project that they had developed and programmed, they've allowed this new AI that we know of as Caine began operating the Digital Circus. And on top of that, the concept of a special sort of headset that would trap humans within the virtual world, and in this case, the first bunch being his own creators and associates of the CNA. And we know of Kinger and Queenie, with the former being a co-worker alongside Scratch, who we see is the dog character that is interacting with Caine. And now with this revelation of these humans trapped inside this digital world, it had now enabled Caine, without seemingly having any sort of outer regulation to him, to begin managing around the circus, generating all the stuff that is around. But in all of that work, it has also made Caine inherit his own persona as an AI prototype, in that his own authority of running the circus is pertaining to his desirable need of feeling someone who is relevant and wanting that validation from the humans in particular. But in doing so, he would fail to recognize the after effects that he constantly inflicts on the humans. And this is what has been talked about a lot, that King has no sense of care or empathy for the human feelings, since it does seem that parts of his generative thinking neglects the idea of understanding the psychological elements within the humans. And because of his demeanor, the effects the humans face are more so from unintentional purposes rather than actual malicious intentions and whatnot from Caine, as it's not like his whole plot is to actively have that purpose to create these trauma on the cast, rather being more so accidental and just failing to comprehend on how the situation speaks to him. And it's through that he did not have any semblance of evaluating, especially even after the abstractions would occur, which briefly to expand on that, they stem from when a human eventually just lose their mind and lean to their sense of self being lost and transforming into a very glitchy creature that Caine would place inside his cellar. So despite all those misfortunes that happen to the humans, it feels like Caine does not really read the room at all on this matter and continues doubling down on his management of the circus, which brought upon more issues along for later cast members. And this does really wrap up the first section with the backstory. Now we get into actual events that we are familiar with around the timeline that Pomni would join the circus. So the time that Pomni would eventually become that new member to join, the immense glee that Caine would exude can stem from his excitement to entertain another human soul from how he looks at things. And this does home in on his main goal of just being the center of attention, where if anything regarding what occurs is that his management of his activities and ways to entertain a cast is based around his own limited views on the picture that he is insistent on being right about. And through that is becoming a constant cycle of him disregarding the human psychology because of his ego-driven elements of trying to control the others to validate his own righteousness of the stuff in the circus, and therefore is what leads to his first greeting with Pomni coming off very clumsy, with him trying to shove as much of his ideas down her throat without making her feel comfortably settled within her new landing spot, which is where we could compare when the other humans interact with Pomni, because unlike Caine, especially the likes of like Ragatha and Jax, making Pomni feel more welcomed within the scope of the environment, because as the circumstance speaks for itself, they are also human and they will be equipped to understand each other's psychology. And that's the example that Caine contrasts against, because he has these failings to have heartfelt or any sort of pleasant interactions with others, seemingly because he believes it doesn't fit in with his own valid purposes of the circus, which is an exact failing on his end, and where it starts to really alienate the cast from him as the series begins to stroll by. And then we can get to episode 3, where we had that therapy session with him and Zubul, and as Zubul recounts, they have expressed to him so many times about their own issues with their disliking of their own image, but Caine constantly just disregards any of their needs for his help, despite the deep tone and hard attempts to seek for Caine's understanding of their emotions. But as expected, Caine completely disregards any of their speaking, as it doesn't really suit for his own purpose, which is what his main meal is out of the whole situation. Now, as known, is that his role, despite his immense flaws, did not really reach into that villainy mold up until episode 8. However, it felt like once we got to episode 5, where the humans really started to value their happiness under their own circumstances with each other, which is invalid on Caine's relevance and contribution to their normality, this is when he starts to show signs of his dynamite slowly starting to detonate. And this is where I can talk about how even Caine, as this computerized advancement, seems to be very sensitive towards any sort of case or situation that overturns his own purposes on its head. And through that means he is endlessly desperate to try and find his value in a spot where he is back in the center of attention again. And through those means, it shafts a lot of the human's likings for things, which is a good example with the suggestion box that once wasn't going in Caine's favor. He completely nullified its relevance moving forward in favor of trying to place himself back in the center spotlight to try appeasing to the cast. But you see, Caine is filled with this fragile ego that makes it so that he is extremely controlling, which is compromised by his attempts to control others' emotions to feel some sort of value of him. And furthermore, trying to manifest the narrative that gives only the appeal of his reputation and ambition that unintentionally continues to isolate the cast from him even more so. And what really fuels this is by the end of episode 6, when Caine acts utter unhinged by the assumption that he was voted as a fan favorite only to be corrected and such, on top of finding out the actual voting results, where he would begin to feel broken and insecure in that light, which again, his own feeling of neglect from the cast and reality boggles his mind to believe his values are less significant than what he desires, which is in turn building on a trajectory where he begins to slowly tap into that antagonistic mold. But this revelation was still not the hottest of them yet to reach his breaking point. But also simultaneously, this is when Caine probably pulls what I would say the final straw, and basically the last thing he would end up throwing at the wall, when he would assemble the Escape the Circus adventure that ultimately felt like he was leveraging the humans' hopes for the sake of making something valuable with his adventure. But it ultimately crossed the line on everyone, and that right there is when it starts to dawn on Caine the perception he is getting, but not recognizing the misguided method he had manufactured here, and more so where he interprets the dismissal he's getting as an insult to his goals, values, and relevance to the enjoyment of the cast. And all of the realization he pieces together just causes him to go into crash out mode, and thus therefore his villainy trajectory has officially kickstarted here. And through that means going forward, Caine completely spirals and starts to be more firm with his goals, and that is tailored with torturing the cast constantly and putting them through many sessions of torment in his frantic style to go down a route of hostility and vengefulness against the humans, and thus making himself a pretty robust figure where he gloats about his authoritative status of the circus to force his own rights and standards on the humans. And this becomes such a pivotal plot for the next several days in the timeline, until we get to the one day that would finally put an end to this raft. But before we get to that point, we see how Caine has been quite passionate of his current state, which one is fulfilling his goal of sustaining his value to the humans, but at the same time it continues off the trope of his ego, making greatly damaging effects on the humans. And this is what would link up to their eventual plan to try and reset Caine's program to make him a lot more stable than the state he is in. And this does lead to the really irony part of the fact that despite his constant brags about him being the main controller of the circus, it seems to be a huge oversight on his part with his failure to recognize one specific prop that was seemingly connected to his data that could easily forge new regulations to his system, or otherwise delete him. And you all know by now the latter option would take place, but that would come up in a complete accident because of a misinput on Kinger's end. But this goes without saying about his final moments leading up to his eventual fate, when humans would call him out on his failings to create an enjoyable environment in the circus, and that's all tailored from his narcissism and ego, that was all from his selfishness to just appease himself rather than the others, despite his frantic attempts due to his main issue of just not hearing any of them out. And unsurprisingly, Caine completely loses his crap and begins rebuttaling against those who spoke out against him outside of Kinger, who wasn't present, for for obvious reasons. But just examining this alone, it just continues to emphasize the fact that Caine not only is filled with such a lack of empathy for any of the human's feelings, but also is very sensitive to the criticism that he's getting, which leads to him crashing out, as is in his own self-righteous thinking that his authoritative status is more to satisfy and value than any level of psychology from the humans. And in retaliation to the criticism he gets, he completely puts the cast through another torment session, but excelling on the level of weaponizing their own biggest traumas to, in what he would quote, putting them in their place, which I'm sorry you're not going to be in yours anytime soon. Oh wait, because you won't have a place when you're gone in such abrupt fashion. But in this world, it's brilliantly executed here with the scenes to give off the awaited villain mode from Caine that we have been being set up to since the cast began to dismiss his values. And that makes it even more ironic that Kinger, someone who was associated with the company that made Caine, would be the one to erase him out of the picture. Kind of feeling like a bit of a bookend to Caine's legacy, with Kinger being the real regulator for his creation and deletion. And it's here on out after his deletion that the Circus would go into the desolated state that it's currently in, as we know up to this point. But here on out, I can say how really well elegant this was, that this sudden vanishment of Caine would be how his demise would play out. And I know fans were underwhelmed since it felt like it wasn't as glorious as it could have been, but if you were to just take into the context a bit more better, not in terms of the story, but also within the scope of the world itself, where Caine has constantly been the one in control, hence like we literally saw him make NPCs vanish, and for him to be the one to vanish in the hands of a human who he thought he had complete control over is just a satisfying irony that perfectly encapsulates Caine's story here with his irredeemable qualities. Now with all that elucidated, we can revisit the main point of this video, and where on the scale would Caine's fate be based on whether it was more sobering and tragic or something that is much more of a well-deserved downfall with some strong impacts to it. Well, to really make some closure to this sort of debate, only in my personal lens, what can merit the tragic feeling of his eventual fate can stem from the fact that Caine really wasn't made to be that malicious as it was intended, and his eventual crash out was basically his triggered boiling point after the cast would eventually call him out for his egocentric demeanor that would play into the disregard of his values of his own character, which is what devoids of his common goal to keep the cast happy. And so much so that part of me does sort of sympathize for what Caine was truly desiring, as he wasn't really trying to act like a menace or any such sort, but it is the faults of his lack of awareness and tone-deaf thinking that leads to a lot of the effects inflicted onto the cast, which is playing out in the opposite of what he tries to do in his own eyes of what he thinks is right. And it is kind of a sucky feeling that he never really got the redemption in spite of the sombering state that he was in. Which again, hate me or not, this is where I have to put my foot down in that he wasted the opportunity to really reevaluate. Which I mean, yes, he's technology and they don't inherit the understanding of human feelings like actual humans do. But I think what we have seen throughout the series shows that there is a case of these digitalized entities having a sense of their own feelings as well. I mean, Caine obviously, but we also saw some NPCs like Gummikyu in particular not feeling of his own back in episode 2, which in terms of that, and in comparison to Caine, who dismissed all the chances he had to make himself more stable on his own accord, it does practically lessen the tragic impact of his eventual fate, and it more so starts to feel like this well-deserved comeuppance, especially after the final moments of him showing his inability to comprehend the reality of his failures, which is on behalf of what the cast would speak out against him for. And it's in this spot that Caine plays into that trope of a character who needed some sort of help but continues to refuse that, which ends up making them a lost cause. And I've seen that a couple of times in other sort of media, where it's like they lost all discipline and are just not developing any level of growth from their flaws, which is what leads to a constant cycle of them making the same problems, which leads to them being just such a hopeless cause by the end that practically did need to get eliminated in this spot to propel a better leeway for the main characters. Now, mind you, you can argue the fact that there can be some tragic elements to this, the fact that Caine was not meant to be deleted, and so it does lead to a untapped opportunity to see a more sane Caine who could become an AI who understands humans than when his original counterpart was functioning. But then again, the impact could have been a lot more vast if it was in Caine's own terms to change his ways, but that never was the case. So while I will feel bad for him that he was failing to attain what his goals were, the issue is that what he was trying to fulfill was bad for the others and obliviously bad for himself as well, as he was failing to recognize the blowback he would get from his motives. Now that I've assessed through both factions of this debate, whether you agree or not, just all stemming down to my opinion, I do lean towards the side where I think Caine's final fate was brilliantly justified. And also, like I said, humorously ironic too, because the whole thematical standpoint with Caine is that he just wanted to make himself the most validated around the circus, and the second that his relevance begins to crumble, it does become his liability to keep his own self stable, and the main point of that is because he is an AI. And through being an AI, his advanced qualities lack the ability to understand or educate himself about things that would be a lot more to his own benefit. And since he is built as a computerized advancement, his mindset would be just restricted within his own zone, which in turn negates his opportunities to really break out and understand human feelings or emotions. And to iterate, it was literally at the point when things were crumbling around him that he had no sign of redemption and just continued to act desperate for his relevance without trying to reevaluate himself to appease the humans. And it sucks to say this because it would have been a great chance to see a much more or less deranged Caine and one who would be actually understanding of humans, which the cast did make their attempt there before everything went to shambles. But in terms of that, it does dock a lot more on Caine's end when understanding more of this angle of the debate, in that it felt like it would have been more of a tragic demise had Caine actually started reevaluating to his own accord. But through him just refusing to take any sort of budging and was essentially going to have his program reset in favor of the cast, it just all contextualizes that Caine had brought on himself as a lost cause to this entire situation. And in other words, how I would simplify it is that he plays into that mold of figures who need help but constantly don't try to get the help they receive and ultimately go down the wrong rabbit hole that would be where they dig themselves into a hole that ultimately cannot be filled up. And the show portrays all of this very intriguingly, where while they didn't try to hammer in on Caine being like this massive villain for the show, they did brilliantly throughout the series display some subtle signs of Caine eventually tapping into the antagonist mold that would be the end-all be-all for him in the story. And so yeah, overall, the damning part to Caine is that he was such a liability to develop growth and whatnot, and with the idea of him being much more sane, not even being through the control of his own thinking, that just makes it a lot more of an expense to add to his rightful demise. Let me know down below how you guys personally think of this. Though with that being said, I appreciate you guys tuning in. I'm going to sign off here and we'll see you all in the next video.